Somehow, many of us have the idea that God owes us his favor. After all, we're Americans, the defenders of democracy. As we run the race of life, let's ask ourselves if God owes us anything. After examining the evidence, we might have to conclude that what he owes us is his judgment. Today, we'll consider what God thinks of the U.S. of A. Stay with us. From Chicago's Moody Church, this is Running to Win with Dr. Erwin Lutzer, whose clear teaching helps us make it across the finish line. In our current series, we're learning about God and the nations, and today, Dr. Lutzer comes to speak to us about God and the United States.
God bless America. After the 9/11 terrorist attack, God bless America signs were everywhere. God was back. The ACLU looked on in dismay as members of the Congress sang God bless America on the steps of the Capitol. God was allowed off the reservation, and he was allowed to enter into American life, into mainstream American life once again. He was able to at least get his toe off of the reservation. But what kind of a God was back? Well, a very tolerant God. A God who accepted everyone, no matter what religion you were. I'm told that there were 2 porn shops in Nashville who had God bless America on their marquees. It was a very tolerant God. The God who was back was a God who could never possibly judge America, only bless. He was only allowed to bless America. He was the God of capitalism, the God of freedom and democracy, the God that obviously would bless America because look at who we are as Americans. Just look at all of the things that America has done and given the world. Very interestingly, when religious leaders, some of them perhaps unwisely, suggested that this was a judgment of God, the media began to hyperventilate. I mean, there was no possibility that this could be God's judgment. God was not allowed to judge. He was only allowed to bless. Now, I have to say that such remarks are probably unwise for a number of reasons. Number one, we don't know exactly what God is up to. And number two, it may be more of a judgment on the church than America at large. But anyway, the very suggestion that maybe God would judge us was inadmissible. The God who came off the reservation was not permitted to judge. But it's interesting that in the Old Testament, God said to Israel, I lay before you 2 ways. The way of blessing if you obey me, and the way of cursing and judgment if you don't. And today we're saying there's only one side to God's attributes, and that is blessing. Well, let me ask you this question. This happens to be a series of messages on God and the nations, and this is number 5 in the series. Is God actively involved in what happens in nations, in terrorist attacks, for example? The scripture says in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, I form light and I create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do these things. And Amos asks, when disaster comes to a city, has not the Lord caused it? Wow, that's strong language. It doesn't mean that God does it. But it does mean that it's part of his providential work. I mean, he does let it happen. And he could prevent it from happening. So God is involved at the end of the day, is he not? What I'd like to do in the next few moments is to invite you to look with me to the 10th chapter of the book of Isaiah. Because Isaiah is going to give us a window into God's purposes, and we will use the principles that we learned there as a backdrop to do a very, very quick discussion of God and America. All too briefly, I might add. One of the problems with this series always has been that I've got more information and so much more could be said, but we will give you an overview as we talk about God and America. Isaiah chapter 10 is very fascinating as it gives us this window into God's purposes because of the fact that God is going to show us there principles by which he judges nations. Principles that, if properly interpreted, are still applicable to us today. The 10th chapter begins with God listing some of the sins that he was going to judge them for. Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees. I need to stop there, because someone has said, show us your laws, and I will show you your God. And how true that is. And the great battle in America is for laws. It's for the judges. It's for the Supreme Court. It's for who says what can happen and what can't happen. But God says, woe to those who make unjust laws. And then he says, to deprive the poor of their rights. Someday I'm going to preach about that, because the Old Testament particularly says so much about the poor. And God often judges people on the basis of the way in which they treat the poor. And then he says, those who are cruel and ruthless, they make widows their prey and rob the fatherless. God says that's what's happening in Israel. And that isn't a total list of all of Israel's sins, but many of them. And God says for that you're going to be judged. And now the principles of God's judgment. First of all, God uses an evil nation to judge his own people. He uses an evil nation to judge his own people. A nation that is more evil than his own people. You'll notice he's going to use Assyria. Verses 5 and 6. Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger, in whose hand is the club of my wrath. Send him against a godless nation. I dispatch him against a people who anger me, who seize loot and snatch plunder, and to trample them down like mud in the streets. See what God is saying? He's saying that Assyria is my rod to discipline Israel. It is the club of my anger. Well, what about this nation Assyria? Now, when I speak about Assyria today, I'm not talking about the Assyrians that we have here at the Moody Church. You know that we have Assyrians here